My purpose in this video is to give you a way of thinking about game theory that might be a little bit different than you're used to thinking about it. And I'm going to call this embodied game theory, where the point is that you have this model that is really about a relational pattern. And it's not necessarily a bad relational pattern. It can be good. In fact, it's going to capture most relationships, including the most beautiful ones where there's sort of a push and a pull and a give and a take, where people sort of navigate the different desires and the collaborative desires, and it's beautiful. But the point here is that having this embodied way of thinking about game theory will allow you to use the game theory as a way of pointing to something where you're trying to develop out your intuition about the way relationships work when this dynamic happens. There's going to be a whole bunch of just human things that go along with what happens when this dynamic plays out that cannot be captured in the math, but the math will point you to that dynamic. That's sort of the purpose of this video. This video is part of my series on the political economy of the dragon, where the dragon is the system we live in. And the system is an economic system, a governance system, and a knowledge system intertwined. So the dragon itself is the game theory forces that make up the dragon's behavior, the way it moves, what it prioritizes, how it interacts with social systems in the environment. And I also want to convince you that you have a role in this, because to understand the game theory of the dragon, there has to be an understanding from particular vantage points. It's not going to be an understanding where it's a perfect model that works well from every different vantage point in the system. Rather, we're going to need people who have a placement inside the system where they can see specific sociological forces and specific drivers of people in their own community. And those specifics are part of the story that feeds in with, I think, a better structure of thinking about economic systems and economic theory. Now, what are the layers of game theory that we need to track? Because there's going to be layers that have their own properties, but also are a little bit interwoven. This is why I'm using the imagery of tapestry, because threads of one layer will weave in and out with threads of other layers. So there's 4 layers that I'm going to lay out in this video, and I'm sure this will evolve as I move along the series, but one I'm going to say gut theory of game theory is one of the layers. And part of this is to draw people's attention to the fact that most game theory happens in the gut. Most game theory is not strategic from the brain where you're thinking through costs and benefits explicitly. Most of it is, my gut tells me to do this, and I do it. And the gut has wisdom, and the gut also can be attached to negative motives. The gut is neither good nor bad, although the gut can capture things that are at a deeper layer than you can capture with your conscious mind. So we'll want to develop a strong intuition for the way gut game theory operates and the way it interacts with the deliberative layer. And of course, that's going to be our second layer of game theory, is the deliberative layer, the strategic layer. And that's usually how you think about game theory when you're first learning it, is the explicit deliberative strategic level. And then the third layer is the layer of collective wisdom or collective myth making. And this is where the guts of many people are sort of trying to understand what's going on and trying to put together a collective and shared understanding of what's valid, of how things are working. And that's going to be a really important layer if we're thinking about the nature of the dragon and the way it connects with economic myth, for example. And then the last layer is going to be the layer of money, because of course money is a key force for moving power and for movement and dynamics in our system. But I think a lot of people do not think of this correctly, or do not think of this certainly the way I think of it. So I'm trying to add my perspective on it to the table. And what I find actually when I look at people who think of it in ways that I think are not deep enough, it's that the way they're thinking about things works from a particular vantage point. It's like, okay, if you're sitting here and you're looking at it like that, that model works just fine. But if you look at it from a different angle or look at it from a closer angle, there's something going on that doesn't work with that model. So our hope here is to have flexible ways of looking at things from different vantage points. That's the hope. And there's an artistic element to understanding the dragon, because it's not like there's this one model and everybody's going to understand the one model of how things work. And even this whole gut theory and deliberative theory of game theory, that's a model. And in reality, these things are not separated in a purely binary way, but to learn them well, you first think of them separately. You develop an intuition for how they work that's different from each other. And then once you have a really solid intuition for that, then you start to weave them together. And it's a little bit like blending if you're doing a painting. It's like you've got these two colors, you put the paint on there, and then once the paint's on there, then you start to blend. And that blending is going to be the approach to this dragon, where the blending is going to involve blending different perspectives and different vantage points. And that leads us to our next point, which is the embodied version of the dragon. What this means is these models are not models where we're moving towards something that is disembodied and is this false version of the model. The false versions start at the first level. When you're coming into an economic class, you have to learn the most simplistic versions. But maturing your economic understanding involves taking these as maps, taking these as patterns that you might observe in the real world. And they're useful because if you didn't have these maps or patterns, you might completely miss those patterns, those in many ways relational patterns that happen in the real world. But because you're learning the map, which might have binary versions of things, it might have overly simplified versions of things, it will. But you recognize that and you start to look for the pattern in your regular life and in the systems that you operate within. And you recognize, wait a second, okay, this pattern, it tends to play out in this particular way. And by observing it in your real life, you're going to understand not just the bare bones of the model, but the other dynamics that tend to accompany that particular relational pattern. So embodying an idea or a model does mean developing the intuition with how it plays out in your life. Now, because it is a relational pattern, we know no relationship is the same as any other relationship. And yet, there are relational dynamics that do appear in many different relationships, and they appear in a unique way, but still have similarities. So that's the wrestling with the pattern aspect versus the unique aspect, and blending those, that's how you get to a mature understanding of economics. And this is also why you are called into the story. Because if we think about the nature of the beast, the nature of the dragon, there's going to be a lot of different groups of people, each with their own unique group dynamic that also has parallels to other dynamics. So for example, if you're a teacher, you may be developing an intuition for how school administration works. And that may actually have some pretty profound parallels with the way healthcare administration works, and profound parallels with the way some government bureaucracies work. And you can kind of apply some of the embodied knowledge that you get by starting with the game theory, by looking at the relational patterns in your school that map onto that game theory, by thinking about how those might map on elsewhere in healthcare and bureaucracies, in banks maybe. And the insights that are embodied will actually somewhat translate, though not perfectly, and that's why we need people sitting in different places in the economy. And it's not just people in positions of power that can give us insight into the way the dragon moves. In particular, because the vantage point of somebody who's a cashier or a truck driver or somebody who's just considers themselves powerless in this system, they're able to see things that are not at all visible from positions of power, and that are not even visible from vantage points close to positions of power. And part of that is because power is blind to a lot of things, and it's necessarily blind. To move up inside systems, it is somewhat necessary to be blind to certain things. And that blindness in some ways is one of the weaknesses of the current dragon, the way the dragon's operating. And if there is going to be some sort of collapse towards something more healthy, it will need the insight that is only visible from people who are sitting in a vantage point that is not inside these power structures. And yet it's also obviously going to be essential to have people who are inside the power structures, who oftentimes realize, wait a second, this is not conniving evil behavior from the vast majority of people. It's actually really good, healthy motives that just happen to be structured in a way that are unaware of the destruction that they're taking part in. Another reason it's really important to have people who are sitting inside powerful institutions giving their perspective on the game theory is that sometimes the social dynamics in these spaces of power are really different and systematically different than the social dynamics in spaces lower on the dragon's hierarchy. Like sometimes the personality types that are selected that move up to the top and the just different mechanisms that people get used to as they work their way toward seats of power, those are just different. So it's not going to be possible to fully understand the dragon or to wrap our minds around the game theory of it without people in these unique types of seats of power in the dragon's head or whatnot. And it's also not true that every seat of power has the same social dynamics or the same game theory. Like Wall Street versus academic institutions versus political spots of power, these all have different dynamics, and only people who have a seat from the inside can fully see that. So I hope you get a sense for why painting a true picture of the dragon requires people from many vantage points coming together and blending their different perspectives about the social dynamics in their setting. Now, one of the first principles of game theory is what I call the gut theory of game theory. And to be clear, this is not different than regular game theory. I'm sure some economists are going to be really annoyed that I'm creating this binary distinction between gut theory and deliberative theory. But I think it's helpful. In some ways, I think biologists have an advantage here because they're used to thinking of game theory as being about frog behavior or monkey behavior or whatever. And the frogs obviously don't have a deliberative aspect to what they're doing. They're just compelled to do something. And that thing in their gut that tells them to go do it, that has a certain wisdom and logic to it according to the frog's world. And humans have the same thing, and that's usually the biggest thing driving us. Even if we have some story we're telling in our heads about why we're doing something, oftentimes it's the gut drivers behind that thing that are the real drivers. We also need to acknowledge that the gut has both good and bad motives. They have motives to promote social harmony. The gut also has selfish motives, and the mind, the brain, tends to not be able to distinguish which of the gut's reactions are selfish versus which are generous. And that's even hard to parse out when you're looking at other people. Are they acting selfishly or are they acting generously? Oftentimes you have to leave that ambiguous, and training that ambiguous part of your brain is part of learning a good version of the gut theory of game theory. The next image that's helpful to learn game theory is the tapestry image. And of course, a tapestry is this woven piece of fabric that often has a story built into it. So oftentimes, historically, that would have been a biblical story or a family story, but the threads are woven together, and the weaving together, I think, is really important when it comes to understanding game theory. And one of the stories I tell myself that helps me to think about the tapestry of game theory is we're imagining a group of teenagers who are having fun over the summer, and they decide to put on a play. And yet there starts to be this disagreement among them about whether it should be a comedy or a tragedy. Like maybe they have two specific plays, one's a comedy, one's a tragedy, and they get into an argument over which one to do. And there's two forces at play here. One is they want to do the play together. The whole purpose is to have fun together. But one of those two groups will win and one will lose. And this is a classic battle of the sexes in game theory. And the battle of the sexes is a particular way that cooperation and competition are woven together. It's not the only way those two things show up, but it's a pattern, and that is a very typical example of that pattern. What's going to happen is at the end of the day, one of those groups will win and one will lose. But after that happens, what tends to happen in the group is people are a little bit extra nice to the people who lost. Maybe what restaurant they want to go to, that one gets to be the one everyone goes along with. People will give them a little bit of extra space to be grouchy. People might be just extra generous to them along various dimensions for a little bit. And that's not indefinitely. It's more just that there's a gut intuition for how to create social harmony in a group. And even when there's something that requires a little disruption of that social harmony, there are mechanisms for bringing it back toward equilibrium. And equilibrium, what is equilibrium? It's not something that anyone ever thinks will ever exist. It's something that pulls things in a particular direction. And in this case, it's people recognize because we chose the comedy and not the tragedy people have sort of lost out. They're going to feel a little bit, they're not going to feel as great inside the group. So extra effort to bring them back in the fold. That is a movement toward equilibrium that will be strong at first and then weak, and then eventually it'll sort of play itself out. You can kind of see in that the woven tapestry, right? You can see here's the game theory moment, the battle of the sexes itself. Here's the movement toward equilibrium that's coming from people's guts. And we also know that different people in the group have different weights they put onto things in their gut. For some people, the social harmony gets a really high weight in the way they interact in a group. And those people are going to be particularly nice to the people who lost that tragedy battle. And for other people, the social harmony thing is less important to them or less salient to them. Now, when I talk about the tapestry, you notice there's a group element to this. And thinking of society as having these overlapping groups where the group forms a shared salience frame, a shared game that they're playing together. And that game is both cooperative and competitive within that group. And if you look at the structure of our society, a lot of people's most important game for their life is their job or their profession. Now, this is more true in spaces of power than it is in spaces where people have more working class jobs. And that may actually end up being quite important for the way the dragon operates. But one style of thought that people have that has partial truth to it, but I think it's blinding people to some of these sociological forces, is people tend to think of historically in the tribal world of the ancient world, people were groupish and that they had a group of people that they developed this tapestry with. Like, that's easy to imagine then. But that modern society tends toward either the individualistic culture, or the group is just everybody in the whole world. And I think there is some truth in that. But if you look at both places, the most individualistic person, oftentimes they're individualistic in the context of a game that's defined in a certain way by a particular group. For example, you might look at Wall Street. There's a very particular sociological game on Wall Street. And people look at that and they say, okay, they're very individualistically competitive in that game. But the metrics or the things along which they are competitive, that is defined by a particular social group and that is heavily reinforced by the game that social group is playing. And it's easy to lose sight of the importance of the social group for the individualistic game, and also same thing for the whole society game. The people who are operating where they are thinking about all of society, or at least they think they are thinking about all of society, may not be sufficiently aware that actually there is a game they are operating within that has sociological bounds and has major blind spots of society beyond which they cannot see. So I think building in this sociological bubble where that bubble determines a group's salience frame, and it determines what they're responsive to in this game theory tapestry. The next helpful way of thinking about game theory, I'm going to refer to this as the doll type of game theory or the relational structure type of game theory. And this is really just capturing the fact that game theory points us to a particular style of relationship that plays out in many different ways in many different relationships. And obviously that happens mostly at the level of the gut. But it's a little bit like when girls play with dolls. Those dolls have relationships. Like, I played with My Little Ponies growing up, and there was a mother pony and a daughter pony. There was a girlfriend and a boyfriend pony. So those structures, the mother-daughter structure of a relationship, we develop an understanding of how that works, not just by knowing that mother and daughter exists as a structure, but by embodying it, by looking at how does mother and daughter work for me and my mother, for that girl and her mother, for this dog and its puppy. How do I look at the world with many different structures of the mother-daughter relationship and develop an intuition not just for what the relationship means, but for how that relationship plays out. And I think that game theory pattern is really helpful to get us unstuck from a particular disembodied, static way of viewing the world. And an example here is viewing somebody as being the bully. The bully is something that is inherent to the way a person is. Now, I am absolutely not arguing that people have inherent ways of being that are built into their character. That's definitely true. But if you look at the game of chicken in game theory, the classic game of chicken is you have two teenage boys who decide to drive at each other at full speed, and whoever swerves first is chicken, whoever stays in the position and doesn't swerve is king of the hill, and there's a status thing that goes along with being king of the hill. So you might imagine after that stupid exercise, the king of the hill guy, he might be a little more of a bully for a couple of weeks. He might have gained enough status to kind of pick on some other guys, and that's kind of a bully behavior. But if we see that and we start thinking, okay, there's a bully and there's a person being bullied in that situation for the 2 weeks after that, we miss the aspect that, wait a second, if the game had gone the other way, the person who is the bully would have been different. And of course, if you win the king of the hill exercise, whatever that happens to be, in whatever social context has defined king of the hill for you, if you're in that king of the hill role for long enough, it's going to transform your character. It's going to transform the more fixed aspect of who you are. But at the same time, this game theory aspect adds this dynamic to it that I think sometimes we miss in the way we view people in a static way. I don't know if that made sense, but my point here with the dolls is that the game theory is giving us a structure of a relationship that has movement to it and that plays itself out in many different types of relationships. And our purpose in trying to understand the dragon is to take the basic structure and to look for that structure in many places to see how things move and change. The video's over, I'm just rambling. And on my last video on the dragon, there were people who referred to Moloch. And Moloch is an incredible personification of a game theory concept. I do want to say the dragon I envision is not the same thing as Moloch in the way I use the term Moloch. So eventually I will do a video on Moloch. I've actually been meaning to do this for a really long time. In fact, I bought these two monsters a year ago because one of them's Moloch and one of them is Baal. It's going to be a sibling of Moloch. These are going to be different game theory concepts. These guys have other siblings, but I haven't done it yet. Hopefully in the next, say, 3 months or so, I'll get around to doing my Moloch video. But the reason this is not the dragon is because in the article, the Slate Star Codex article, Moloch represents a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma. And that's just one specific type of game theory. It's not all game theory forces. I would actually argue it's not the main forces that are driving our system into a bad place, though of course it's part of the story and all of these game theory forces are deeply intertwined. And I do think some people will use the term Moloch to mean all all possible game theory forces. So some people will use that term the way I use the dragon, but I'm going to be a little more specific than that. And I don't have any problem with people using language in a way that's different than what I use it. But I just wanted to be clear on that in terms of how I will be using the term mullet.